They said it was a defensive network, a secret army, hidden across Europe. Officially, it existed to resist a Soviet invasion, but decades later, declassified investigations revealed something darker. Explosions in train stations, bombs in crowded piazzas, mass shootings blamed on extremists, and behind the chaos, a covert NATO stay-behind structure tied to Western intelligence, including the CIA. Operation Gladio was never meant to be public. It was built in silence, funded in secret, denied for years. So why did European governments later admit it existed? And what exactly were these hidden armies doing during peacetime? Because if the documents are right, this wasn't just preparation for war. It may have been something else entirely. When World War II ended, Europe was physically destroyed, but politically it was just beginning to fracture. The Soviet Union had expanded westward. Eastern Europe was falling behind what Winston Churchill would call the Iron Curtain. Western leaders were terrified that communist parties could rise to power not through invasion, but through elections. Italy was the greatest fear. In the late 1940s, the Italian Communist Party was one of the strongest in Western Europe. In France, communist influence was rising. Greece had already fallen into civil war. Washington saw a pattern. What if tanks never crossed the border, but ideology did? And so, quietly, NATO began preparing for a scenario that had not yet happened. If the Soviets invaded Western Europe, regular armies might fall quickly. Occupation could happen in days, but resistance could survive underground. The idea was simple. Create secret stay-behind networks in NATO countries, train them, arm them, hide weapons caches across rural areas, recruit loyal anti-communists. If invasion came, they would sabotage bridges, assassinate occupying officers, and organize guerrilla warfare. It sounded defensive. It sounded logical. And in many ways, it was. Britain's MI6 had already experimented with similar networks during World War II. The CIA, founded in 1947, inherited that strategic thinking. So by the early 1950s, clandestine units began forming across Western Europe. Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, Greece, even neutral Switzerland had a version. These networks operated under strict secrecy. Only a handful of officials inside each government knew of their existence. Weapons were buried in forests, explosives hidden in sealed containers, radio equipment stored for emergency activation. Parliament members were not informed. The public was never told. The name Gladio, meaning short sword in Latin, referred specifically to the Italian branch, but over time, the name became shorthand for the entire European stay-behind structure. For years, nothing happened. No invasion came. No activation orders were issued. The Cold War remained cold. But that is where the official story becomes complicated. Because if these networks were purely defensive, waiting for a Soviet invasion, why did investigators decades later discover links between Gladio operatives and internal political violence? Why were some members tied to extremist groups? Why were hidden arms caches discovered not in preparation for invasion, but in connection with domestic unrest? And why, in 1990, did the Italian Prime Minister publicly confirm that the network existed? That announcement triggered shock across Europe, because suddenly what had been dismissed for years as conspiracy theory was acknowledged as fact. But that was only the beginning. The real question wasn't whether Gladio existed. The real question was what it had been doing all along. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Europe did not fall to Soviet tanks, but it did begin to fracture internally. Political protests intensified, student movements erupted, labor strikes spread across Italy and France. The Cold War was no longer just about missiles, it was about ideology inside democratic systems. And then the bombs started going off. December 12, 1969, Milan, Italy. A powerful explosion ripped through the Piazza Fontana banking hall. 17 people were killed, dozens injured. Initial blame fell on anarchists. Police arrested left-wing suspects almost immediately. One of them, Giuseppe Pinelli, fell from a fourth-floor police window during interrogation. Officially, it was ruled an accident. Many Italians did not believe that. The bombing marked the beginning of what would later be called the Years of Lead, a violent period of political terrorism in Italy spanning the 1970s and early 1980s. Left-wing extremist groups were blamed for many attacks, but right-wing extremist groups were also active. And here's where the story darkens. Investigative magistrates in the 1980s began uncovering evidence suggesting that certain far-right militants had connections to covert structures that overlapped with stay-behind networks. The phrase that emerged was chilling: strategy of tension. The idea was not to win public support. The idea was to create fear, because fear changes voting behavior. Fear pushes populations towards stronger security measures. Fear weakens radical political movements. Several later court investigations in Italy examined whether elements connected to Gladio had indirect or direct knowledge of certain acts of domestic terrorism. It is important to be precise here. Courts did not conclude that NATO officially ordered bombings, but investigations did reveal that secret arms caches existed, that intelligence agencies had protected certain far-right operatives, and that parts of the stay-behind network operated with minimal democratic oversight. And Italy was not alone. Belgium experienced the mysterious Brabant killings in the 1980s, a series of brutal supermarket shootings that left 28 people dead. The perpetrators were never definitively identified. In Germany, secret right-wing paramilitary networks were later uncovered. Across Europe, whispers spread. Was Gladio purely defensive, or had parts of it evolved into something else? In 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti officially acknowledged the existence of a secret NATO-linked stay-behind army, the admission sent shockwaves through Europe. Parliaments demanded answers. Citizens demanded transparency. For decades, the existence of Gladio had been denied. Now it was real. But confirmation only raised more questions, because if governments could hide secret armies for 40 years, what else had been hidden? For decades, Operation Gladio existed in the shadows. Journalists suspected it. Conspiracy theorists talked about it, but governments denied it. Until October 24, 1990. In the Italian parliament, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stood before lawmakers and admitted something extraordinary. Italy had maintained a secret stay-behind army during the Cold War. It was real. It had been coordinated with NATO, and it had existed for decades. The statement was not a rumor. It was not speculation. It was official. Andreotti confirmed that the network had been created in the early years of the Cold War to resist a potential Soviet invasion. He acknowledged that weapons caches had been hidden throughout the country. The admission triggered immediate shock. If Italy had such a network, what about other NATO countries? Within weeks, similar confirmation surfaced. Belgium admitted it had its own stay-behind structure. France confirmed a version existed. Germany acknowledged participation. Switzerland, though neutral, admitted to maintaining a comparable secret defense network. Across Europe, parliamentary investigations were launched. The question was no longer whether Gladio existed. The question was what it had done. In Italy, a parliamentary commission began reviewing classified files. Judges revisited cases from the Years of Lead. Magistrates re-examined links between extremist groups and state intelligence. The phrase strategy of tension returned to headlines. Did elements within the secret network support extremist violence to prevent communist political gains? Investigations uncovered troubling overlaps. Some far-right militants had connections to intelligence officials. Certain suspects in bombings had prior contact with state security services. Arms caches linked to stay-behind networks were discovered outside official channels. But here is where things became murky. No definitive court ruling concluded that NATO leadership ordered terrorist acts. No document surfaced proving a centralized directive. Instead, what emerged was a gray zone where unofficial relationships, covert protection, and political fear created an environment in which extremist violence was sometimes tolerated, or at least not aggressively stopped. And that gray zone is where public trust began to erode. because democratic governments had secretly funded and armed underground networks for decades without parliamentary oversight. Citizens had voted, debated, protested, all while a parallel military structure existed outside public knowledge. Even if Gladio was initially defensive, its secrecy created suspicion, and suspicion, once confirmed by official admission, is difficult to erase. The Cold War justification no longer satisfied everyone. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and Europe was left asking, if these networks were created to defend democracy, why were they hidden from it? When Prime Minister Andreotti confirmed the existence of Italy's stay-behind army, the revelation did not stop at national borders. Because Gladio was not just Italian, it was coordinated. At the center of the structure was a little-known body inside NATO called the Clandestine Planning Committee, and later the Allied Clandestine Committee. These were not public-facing institutions. They operated quietly within NATO's Cold War command framework. Their purpose? Coordinate secret resistance networks across member states. Representatives from various European intelligence services reportedly met periodically to discuss logistics, training standards, communications protocols, and contingency plans. And, according to multiple historical investigations, the United States, specifically the CIA, played a key role in supporting the development of these networks during the early Cold War. This was not unusual in the context of 1950. The CIA had been created to fight communism globally. Covert operations were standard practice. Funding anti-communist networks in Europe aligned with U.S. strategic interests. The problem was not the creation of the network. The problem was the secrecy and the lack of democratic oversight. In some countries, even senior government officials were unaware of the full structure. Weapons were buried without parliamentary approval. Training exercises occurred outside public record. In Belgium, the stay-behind network reportedly operated under military intelligence structures. In Germany, similar covert preparations were confirmed. Switzerland's P-26 network was revealed in 1990 as well, shocking a neutral nation that believed itself untouched by such Cold War secret architecture. Each country described its version as defensive. Each government insisted the network had never been used for domestic political manipulation. But trust had already been shaken, because in Italy, the investigations into extremist violence had revealed disturbing overlaps between intelligence officials and far-right militants. Not direct written orders, not signed commands, but contacts, relationships, protection. And during the Cold War, intelligence agencies across the world operated in moral gray zones. Supporting unsavory allies was not uncommon, in the name of containment, in the name of stability, in the name of preventing a communist electoral victory. And that is where Gladio becomes uncomfortable. Because if a secret army exists to prevent occupation, that is one thing. But if elements within that structure indirectly influence domestic politics through fear, that becomes something else. By the early 1990s, NATO publicly stated that its stay-behind committees had been dissolved. The Cold War was ending. The justification was disappearing. But the archives were incomplete. Some records were destroyed. Others remain classified. And that leaves historians and citizens with a question that has never been fully answered. Was Gladio simply a contingency plan, or did parts of it cross a line that democratic societies were never meant to tolerate?
The phrase did not come from conspiracy theorists. It appeared in courtrooms, in sworn testimony, in parliamentary investigations. Strategia della tensione, the strategy of tension. The concept was simple and chilling. Create instability, blame the instability on political enemies, shift public opinion toward stronger security, harsher laws, and away from parties seen as radical or sympathetic to communism. Italy in the 1970s was a battlefield, not between armies, but between ideologies. The Italian Communist Party was gaining legitimate electoral support. It was not a fringe movement. It was a serious political force that could potentially enter government through democratic means. For Washington and certain Western strategists, that scenario was unacceptable. Not because Italy would leave NATO immediately, but because it could shift the balance of Western Europe during the Cold War. And then came the violence. 1969, Piazza Fontana bombing. 1974, Brescia bombing. 1980, Bologna train station bombing, killing 85 people. The Bologna attack was one of the deadliest terrorist acts in post-war Europe. The official investigation ultimately convicted members of a far-right extremist group. But during the trials, investigators uncovered evidence that some of these militants had connections to individuals within Italian intelligence circles. Some files had been tampered with. Certain suspects had previously worked with state security services. Information had been withheld. The picture was fragmented, but disturbing. One Italian judge, Felice Casson, reopened parts of the investigation in the 1980s. While reviewing classified material, he discovered references to the secret stay-behind structure. That discovery eventually contributed to the 1990 parliamentary admission. Casson later stated publicly that elements within the state apparatus had protected far-right militants in order to manipulate political tension. It was not a signed directive. It was not a written master plan. It was an ecosystem, an environment where extremist violence could be exploited. And that distinction matters, because historians remain divided. Some argue Gladio was purely defensive and separate from domestic terrorism. Others argue that while NATO did not order bombings, segments of national intelligence services operated in morally ambiguous ways to steer political outcomes. No single document closes the case. No official NATO order has ever been produced showing authorization of attacks. But what remains undeniable is this: a secret armed network existed. It operated outside democratic transparency, and during the same decades, political violence shook Europe in ways that benefited certain strategic outcomes. Coincidence? Parallel events? Or something more intertwined? The Cold War was not fought only with missiles and tanks. It was fought with perception, with fear, with influence. And in that kind of war, the lines between defense and manipulation can blur faster than anyone expects.
By the early 1990s, the Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The threat that justified Operation Gladio was disappearing in real time. And suddenly, Europe learned that for 40 years, secret armies had existed beneath its democracies. Governments responded quickly. They insisted the networks were defensive. They were never activated. They were precautionary structures in case of Soviet invasion. Official NATO statements emphasized that the stay-behind committees had been dissolved. The Cold War was over. The mission was complete. But public trust does not reset so easily. In Italy, parliamentary commissions acknowledged that the Gladio structure had existed and that weapons caches were real. They also confirmed that intelligence agencies had operated with minimal oversight for decades. What they did not confirm, at least conclusively, was a centralized plan to carry out terrorist attacks. And this is where the story resists a clean ending, because two truths can exist at once. Truth 1. A secret NATO-linked stay-behind network existed across Europe. That is documented. Truth 2. Political terrorism during the years of lead involved extremist groups, some of whom had connections to state intelligence circles. What remains debated is the space between those truths. Was there a coordinated strategy of tension directed from above? Or were there fragmented decisions made by individuals operating within a culture of Cold War paranoia? Historians continue to argue. Some former officials insist Gladio was purely defensive and unfairly linked to terrorism. Some investigators maintain that elements inside national intelligence structures deliberately allowed instability to influence political outcomes. There is no signed NATO order that says, "conduct attacks." There is no universally accepted smoking gun. But there is this: democratic governments funded secret armies without informing their citizens. Weapons were buried in forests. Parallel military structures existed beyond parliamentary control. And when these structures were finally exposed, many records were incomplete, destroyed, or still classified. Operation Gladio forces an uncomfortable reflection. During the Cold War, Western democracies feared communist expansion so deeply that they prepared for occupation in secret. They justified extraordinary measures in the name of survival. But secrecy, once normalized, expands. And once citizens discover that hidden structures operated for decades without their knowledge, trust becomes fragile. Was Gladio a necessary shield against a real Soviet threat? Or did parts of it evolve into something democracy was never meant to contain? Perhaps the answer lies not in a single document, but in the atmosphere of the time. Fear, ideological rivalry, and a belief that protecting democracy sometimes required bending its rules. The Cold War ended, but the question remains relevant. If governments build secret networks today in the name of national security, would the public ever know? And if they did, would it be decades too late?